We will get started. All right. So, like I said, uh, we are going to be talking about um, the ethics of relationship today. And we're gonna the bit that you just worked on and drawing out sketching out this interdependence map is going to be especially relevant to the second thing that we're going to talk about at being ethics rooted in community. So the ethics of relationship can be understood within philosophy from sort of two different angles. The first angle is one, or perspective, or maybe lens. Actually, lens is a good. So you can, like, if you think of like filters, remember back when there were like those really bad filters for all the photo apps and stuff. I mean, there still are, but you could think of the ethics of relationship as you have two different filters you can put on it. You could put the care ethics filter on it, or you could put the ethics rooted in community filter on it. And the care ethics filter is the filter that the chapter talked about in the beginning. And we're going to spell out a little bit what that looked like, and then we're going to turn and we're going to look at ethics rooted in community. And in particular, like I just said, when we're looking at the ethics rooted in community, we're going to see these interdependence maps. Really, they do a lot of work for us on an ethical level. So those last two questions, maybe that some of you are struggling with, like being like, what? Like, I'm going to explain. There's one, or the well yeah the different people who have taken this approach, written about the ethics of relationship through that lens, or through that, with that filter on. They give some pretty clear guidelines for understanding how to take those kinds of interdependence maps and then use them to draw out moral values, essentially. So when we've talked about that web, right, where you have the cluster of values in the middle, for the ethics rooted in community in particular, but also ethics of relationship more generally, those interdependence webs, those or those interdependence maps, those operate at the center of the web. Those are the things that you pull out and identify the most important moral values within the ethical theory. And then we're going to talk about the main challenges for the ethics of relationship. And then the last thing we're going to do is, like, I'm going to leave it up to you all to lead a module 3 review. And what that means is I've posted the module 3 worksheet, and I'm going to give everybody some time to look over, especially for those of you who haven't seen it yet, to look that over. And then you can take time in class today and ask any, like, I don't understand what this question is asking, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's going to be our plan for today. Okay. So, let's get started. Just all right. Oh, Tianika, yeah.
So, Professor, if I'm not wrong, we're not going to be working in groups with the module worksheet. That's just on us, correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
And I'll talk about, I don't know if everybody remembers, I talked about this in the very beginning. You're more than welcome to work with one another on those module 3 worksheets. I know that you all have it seems like a really good and productive WhatsApp group chat going, so you're welcome to work in there. And then I am gonna like flag a couple things about how I would like for that to work. Obviously, I don't have control over what you talk about in your group, but like I will have some sort of like guidelines to help people navigate how to work in that or utilize that great tool that you all have put together for yourself.
Okay,
So,
thank you, Professor.
huh? What was that?
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, the ethics of relationship focuses on our connections to one another, right? So, those interdependence maps, drawing out some connections. And this can be from, our immediate family to, as we kind of move out, larger any human community. And in some cases, it could even go beyond human community. It can go into our relationship with our ecological system, right? So plants and animals, the earth, that sort of thing. And the way that the textbook defines the ethics of relationship is it's about recognizing how our many communities, right? Because you spelled out a bunch of different communities in those interdependence maps. And I'm sure if I, asked anyone here to give me 5 different communities they belong to, probably none of you would have any issue as soon as you got going thinking about it, identifying at least 5. Like that's a really the use of the word community here can be a very broad one, and we're gonna see how broad it gets in our discussion today. So by recognizing how our many communities has this deep impact on who we are, calls forth not only a sense of gratefulness, right? Like the feelings that we have, perhaps the sense of loyalty, maybe some obligations, or just pure love, right? For like family and friends and these sorts of things. So it calls to recognizing, acknowledging, looking at those connections to community not only makes us grateful, but also gives us this responsibility to care for and participate in those communities. So another way to think about this is like, okay, so, thinking about sitting down and like listing off the different communities to which you feel you belong, looking at that and sort of like stepping back and being like, wow, like look at all these ties I have to all these like these different groups. Not only, maybe in the feelings are stronger in some communities, but not others, right? Like family, for example, or like a really close friend group, or perhaps like chosen family, right? Like that is a super important thing. It not only makes us feel grateful, it also, as soon as we look at it, we can also start to pick out different obligations, moral obligations that we have as members of those communities. So that is where we're starting from with the ethics of relationship. So when we think of the question of like, what is of intrinsic moral value within the ethics of relationship, what we're the answer to that question are the communities, our relationships, that thing that we're looking at when we're listing off the communities, those relationships, those feelings, those senses of obligations and all of those sorts of things that we have, that's at the core of what the ethics of virtue takes to be intrinsically valuable, is the relationship. And when we're asking what kinds of, all right, so like say I'm somebody that's like, all right, I am 100% full on ethics of relationship person. Like that is like my ethical theory that I adopt. And that's like my, those are the ethics that guide my actions. So if we're like that kind of person, we're saying, like, we find ourselves in a situation, some kind of maybe like a moral dilemma or something like that, and we ask ourselves, what should I do? The answer is going to lie in what the relationship, the relevant relationship or relationships involved in that question about what I should do. We're going to look at what those kinds of relationships require of us, what sorts of expectations arise within those relationships. So, for example, I think something that we're all very familiar with is the idea, if you are in a monogamous relationship with a person, a romantic monogamous relationship, what is, somebody tell me, give me an expectation that comes within that relationship, some kind of obligation that somebody has in a monogamous relationship. Maria, yeah.
Being faithful.
Being faithful. Yeah, this is something we like talk about all the time, right? So, and I think because so many people have different definitions of that, right? For some people, chatting with exes is considered not being faithful, right? So in thinking about okay, so, based off of this relationship that I have with this particular person, and I know that they think that it's not okay to talk with my ex, right? There might be a sense of okay, so I have this obligation, not to speak with my ex. And that might be really complicated by the fact that, say, you're someone who is friends with, personally for me, with one or two exceptions, my whole life, I'm still friends with all of my exes, good friends. And that's actually something that is really important to me. So the people my husband now completely understands that, right? And that was something that he knew about me going in. So we have these kinds of agreements and expectations built from this unique relationship that we have with one another. So even, so according to our relationship, that's something that would not be considered cheating, for example. So this is that idea, pulling out those kinds of obligations, those sorts of things, and looking at different relationships. That's kind of that's the way that we go about figuring out what to do within the ethics of relationship. And as we're going to see, when we start to think about things more on a cultural level, it's going to start to get really complicated, where there's going to be a little bit less autonomy, perhaps, in being able to decide, what certain expectations and obligations look like. The main idea, though, and this was, one of the things that I was hoping that people would see when they're drawing their interdependence maps, is that even when, say, you're Ray and you want to be alone in the morning and just make your coffee and you don't want to talk to anybody, still, in a really important sense, you're never alone. Your coffee comes from somewhere, right? You need other people around you, demanding electricity, essentially, so that you'll have enough people to make it worth having, sending electricity off of some kind of electrical grid, right? If you're way out in the middle of nowhere, you're the only one, there's no reason to set up the infrastructure to send one person way out in the middle of nowhere electricity. That's kind of the idea behind this phrase, living off of the grid. So when we when we are this goofy little image is something that I want you to just keep in mind as we're sort of talking through the implications of the ethics of relationship. And it's just the center of the idea being we don't exist in isolation. We exist by virtue of our connection to other people, even when we're in a place where we don't want to talk or connect with other people, which can feel like a little bit of a contradiction, but I'm hoping that by the end of this lecture, it'll feel a little bit more like it makes sense in your mind a little bit more. So like that kind of confusion that Ray was feeling when he was talking about just wanting to be alone in the morning, like hopefully you'll be able to hold both things in your mind and it won't be too confusing where it's like, yeah, like there's times where it's really important for me to be alone, but that doesn't mean that I ever, fully disconnect from others. Okay, so like I mentioned, actually, before moving on, does anybody have any questions about that general overview of the ethics of relationship? No, we're good.
So just to simplify, that we all need each other.
Mm-hmm.
No one, no matter what, like you cannot say you will not need help or you will not need any, like at some point in our lives, we would need somebody.
Yeah, and there's interesting things that come out of that. So if we remember, and this is in particular, like remember I said how there's going to be two different filters that we can put on the ethics of relationship. Mm-hmm. So what you were talking about, and really what I was emphasizing, is very much this second one.
Okay.
But both start with this idea. So yeah, I mean, and I apologize because I think maybe I made that a little bit confusing, but both start with just this general observation that we have these important connections to one another. Yes. So this is like an empirical fact, sort of like if we recall when we were talking about utilitarianism, right? Like it started like the 3 steps to like a utilitarian ethical theory. The first step was about this empirical fact that humans seek pleasure. This is just a fact of the matter. And from that, what utilitarians derive was an ethical theory. So it's kind of a similar approach within the ethics of relationship, where we start with this empirical fact about how, like no person is an ocean and like no one person is an ocean. Like we're all always, somehow interconnected. We start with that fact. And then from there, we pull out these different moral values. And the first approach that we are going to be looking at is, or rather the first filter that we see, or rather, yeah. So, I'm trying to think of the clearest wording for this. So the first filter we're going to apply to that fact about us in order to pull out this ethical theory is going to be the care ethics filter. So, like the textbook talked about, one big figure in that approach to this particular ethical theory is Carol Gilligan. She's a psychologist, and she was working with another psychologist. I can't remember his first name. His last name is Kohlberg, on building these models for child development of ethical reasoning. And she was looking at the work. So, and what that means for those of you who don't know is like looking at the different stages that children take in terms of their ethical development. And a lot of that work centers around thinking about other people. So they'll, like give kids tasks to do or ask them questions about certain things. And what they'll look for, and they'll do it at various ages. So like they'll start with a group of 2-year-olds, they'll ask them to do some tasks or ask them, some kind of question. And they will see like the 2-year-olds are very self-focused, like maybe they only think about things from their perspective and that sort of thing. And then they'll look at a group of 4-year-olds and they'll say, oh wow, like the 4-year-olds start to really like think about the other person and that sort of thing. And so then what these psychologists in these kinds of studies do is they start to say, okay, so we have, like kids at X age, for the most part, are, still really thinking about themselves. That's their moral stage of development. And then by the time they're 4, most of them are able to start like thinking about other people. That sort of these. So these are the kinds of studies they're doing in looking at, these development of ethical reasoning skills in children. And what Gilligan noticed about Kohlberg's model is that it was very but the way she described it was like male centric. It wasn't like like I was just talking about like this, like, this very egocentric approach, and then children develop like to think more about other people. Kohlberg's model did not look like that. The model that I was just describing for Gilligan is one that takes more of a feminine approach. And that's the word that she used, where it's this kind of like motherly care, nurturing, thinking about other people's feelings, that sort of thing, that she felt was missing. And sort of in realizing this blind spot in Kohlberg's scientific model, like in his research and the conclusions he was drawing from his research, she started to sort of think more seriously about how this world of relationship and these like psychological truths involve or rather can come with this like awareness of a connection between people. And from there, right, the connection, we can pull out an ability to recognize our responsibilities and obligations, moral values, right? Those sorts of things. So the quote there that is on the PowerPoint is sort of what Gilligan felt Kohlberg's approach was missing. And as a result, she started to like study girls, and like their interpersonal relationships, all these sorts of things. So one thing that I do want to mention about this model is that there's a bunch of problems with, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about challenges to the ethics of relationship. There are a lot of problems with the way that both Gilligan and Kohlberg were carving up the world. And one I'm going to flag in particular right now is this like essentializing based on gender. So the way that Gilligan is drawing this contrast is like this like male kind of like self-centered obligations, those sorts of things, versus like the female, the feminine, which is like caring and being motherly and all of these like facts about like women and stuff like that. And one really big problem with Gilligan's approach is that she's essentializing women in ways that are problematic. And we don't necessarily have to sort of cast this very like gendered picture or this like very like these like hard gender lines on what she's talking about here. There's, I just raised one issue about essentializing women. There's a number of other issues that we could raise with specifically the terminology she's using. It's like she's talking about these two different ways to sort of like look for, or these two contrasting ways to sketch out our like moral sensibilities. And, like we got like the masculine approach and we got the feminine approach. And we don't have to think about those things in opposition, and we don't have to tie either of those things to gender, which is why Nell Nodding's approach to care ethics is maybe a better one to understand. So I feel like just in general, because we're just familiar with like how, like there's so many different ways that like women are socialized and like different like characteristics involved with that and expectations, right? Those sorts of things. When Gilligan uses the word feminine, like we're kind of familiar with this idea of like, yeah, the person who's the caretaker, that sort of thing. But like we're going to talk about, there's issues in how she's like carving up and using the terms to describe the stuff she wants to talk about. And Nell Nodding's approach is a little less problematic in that way. So she's trying to really look at what Nell Noddings is doing is like, she's really trying to look at what's at the heart of the idea of what Gilligan is talking about when she's using this word like feminine. And this is really where we see this idea of care ethics coming through, where she's like, it's not so much that as much as it is like this caring for others in these relations that we have. And so what Noddings argued was that once we look at these relations, so she uses this word ontological. So ontology is the study of things that exist in the world. And one way to understand this word is by contrasting it to the word metaphysical, which maybe is causing some more confusion in people right now. Yeah, so I'd like to ask everybody in the chat box, yes or no. Have you ever heard somebody say like, oh, that's super meta, or like, yeah, you're like, that's like a meta joke, or using the word meta? Just yes or no in the chat box. Okay. That's not everybody. I want everybody, yes or no in the chat box. Have you ever heard anybody say something about like, oh yeah, you're getting really meta?
I'm thinking about Facebook.
Oh, meta. Literally meta. Yeah, the metaverse. Okay, that's awesome. Okay, great, wonderful. That's so perfect. Thank you. That was Victoria, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Yeah, that's so helpful. Okay, so that is perfect because when we talk about that kind of meta, right? Like what Mark Zuckerberg was trying to do with that is saying like, this is something that exists like beyond our physical interactions with one another, because the metaverse is like, it's the virtual reality stuff. It's the stuff beyond the physical. Now, in philosophy, something existing in virtual reality is not, I don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking like, oh, virtual reality is like the same as like metaphysics. It's not at all. But it's what Mark Zuckerberg was doing, or whoever made up that. I mean, personally, I feel like it's a little bit of like a ridiculous thing, but made up that word to describe the thing but that's what they were alluding to. They were like kind of like using some poetic license there and talking about, yeah, this thing that like exists beyond like the physical. I mean, it's still technically physical, right? Because it like relies on our computers and like technology and all of that stuff. But you can think of that kind of meta, the beyond the physical stuff. So especially when we're like talking in abstraction about things, which is anytime you felt kind of like confused, like what the heck is Leah talking about in class, where I'm like trying to talk about these ideas and then I say something in some way and then people are like, wait, can you say that in a different way? Oftentimes what I'm doing there is I am abstracting. I'm trying to develop concepts, sort of like draw conceptual schemes for us to understand these things in abstraction. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about like meta, or talking about metaphysics. And that contrasts ontology, or certain ontological truths. The ontological stuff is the stuff like on the ground happening in the world, right? I just wanted to really clear up that word just in case, because I anticipated some people maybe felt a little confused about it. So all of that to say, tiny tangent there. Hopefully it's cleared a little bit of things up for people. But all of that's to say that an ontological relation for noddings and in philosophy more generally are the kinds of relations that we have in the interdependence maps that you drew, in our communities, within our families, that sort of thing. Like these like direct, immediate, like on the ground physical relationships with one another. And what Noddings argues is that, as you know, by taking that relation as this, you know, this real thing existing on the ground, and that's just a basic fact about our existence, that simply means that what we're doing is we recognize human encounter and our effective responses as a basic fact of our existence. So as soon as we start drawing those interdependence maps, we recognize that our human encounters and our effective responses, meaning like are like emotional kinds of responses to those relationships, are just a basic fact of our human existence. And maybe for some of you who did the interdependence maps, you can see some of that. But I think that, you know, as soon as we look at, say, like a really close friend group that we have, like people we consider family or like blood family, and we start to think about the feelings that we have about those relationships, we recognize, this is what Noddings argues, we recognize that this is just those feelings, those kinds of relationships, those kinds of connections are a fact of our human existence. And from those relations, again, right, like I'm talking about pulling, you know, at the center of the web, the sort of grounding principles for the ethics of relationship, we start with this basic fact of our existence. And then from there, we see that our emotions, our feelings, those sorts of things that we have about others, even something as simple as the obligation to like be polite to somebody, like saying thank you if you when you go buy a cup of coffee at a bodega or whatever, something like this, like those, you know, and then the feelings that you get when perhaps you see somebody at like a restaurant, like cursing out, getting upset with, whatever, treating poorly somebody who works in the restaurant. The feeling that gives you when you see that sort of thing, those kinds of feelings are born from our recognition of our connections to one another. Okay. So I think like, it's a term that I'm like really hesitant to use because I think that there's a lot of problems associated with it. But like does anybody know the origin behind the term Karen? We all know this, or rather, actually, first, let me ask, how many people are familiar with the insult Karen, a Karen? Yes or no in the chat box. Okay, it seems like everybody. Now, does anybody know the origin behind that term? Or would anybody like to explain the origin behind that term?
It's when I don't want to sound bad, but it's when a white female
that part's not problematic. That's not the part. Yeah.
It's when a white
woman,
when a white lady usually has problems against people of color when they're doing something that they're not supposed to. They usually like to call them out and make a big scene. Hence why they were given the term Karen, because they're just coming at me for no reason. Like you're bothered by my presence at the moment. Like,
so yeah, so that's how it is. That's that's sort of where it's evolved to. And the problem that I take with it, so the first problem I take with it, unfortunately, Jose, I'm gonna have to call you out in the chat box for this comment that you made and just using it to like willy-nilly describe. And it's mainly the fact that this person is a woman. Like the way that the joke that Jose was making as he was saying, yeah, that lady in the PowerPoint looks like a Karen. So the short blonde hair, white lady, I totally get that. But just using it as this offhand derogatory insult is the part that I find deeply morally problematic. In particular, when other white men use that term, because like Ray was talking about, it's evolved into something to really like call out how white women weaponize their privilege and target and oftentimes endanger people of color, right? Like, I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that, what was her, I can't even remember her name anymore, the woman that was in it's Amy something. She's the one that had her dog off leash, and there's a black man who is a birder. He likes to like look at birds like in Central Park, and he was telling her that that was the area she couldn't have her dog off leash, and then she immediately called the cops and was saying that there was a black man threatening her and that sort of thing. So the place where that kind of behavior originated was, there's a person that we could tie this back to. And it was like, she was referencing like a woman with a white woman, blonde hair, very specific haircut, who's like always calling the manager. So initially it wasn't actually about, Amy Cooper, thank you. It wasn't actually, yeah, Jose, I understand. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, because it is white lady, short blonde hair, like I get it. But the origin of the term actually started with just like this criticism of like, it was just like a high maintenance white lady throwing a fit at the restaurant and like associated with a very specific kind of haircut. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because there is this really visceral sort of association in using that name as an insult. And it started with like this person we know this kind of person that we see that is just like, and has gone viral so many times now, where you're just like, ew, how can you treat another human this way? And it started with just treating like a service worker in a bad way. And that term has evolved to such that it's like, how can you treat an entire group of people this way? Like, how could you like weaponize a particular aspect of someone's identity, like holding that against them and using that as like a way to threaten violence? Like, that is like really morally like abhorrent. Those feelings that we have there when we witness those things, what people like Nell Noddings want to argue is that we are looking at our relationship to one another in various aspects of community, or we're looking at different people we feel connected to, we feel a relationship with, rather. And from that recognition is born some moral obligations. For example, like not to treat the waiter at the restaurant like total garbage. And we can move into a different kind of relationship, just like basic human decency, right? And we can pull out a lot of moral obligations surrounding, an obligation like not to weaponize anti-Black racism against a Black person, right? So that's the kind of stuff that we can, those are like the different spheres that we can sort of apply this kind of ethical approach, the ethics of relationship in particular, to guide our actions and give us some grounding moral principles about, like what we should do under different circumstances. Okay. And one really important thing that comes out of this approach, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more with respect to the challenges that come up for the ethics of relationship is that when we are being particular in that way, we might get some broader moral principles like don't, like actually, so sorry, let me start this again. We are not going to get broad, universal, like Kant level moral principles from this ethical theory. So kind of like we were talking about with virtue ethics, where there's like different obligations associated with like the different like roles that you occupy, that sort of thing. Like the ethics of relationship is really going to lean into that. That is going to be crucial because our responsibilities to one another, born from these unique, oftentimes unique relationships we have, they're going to be hyper specific to your circumstance, the role you're playing, the place, like if this is like, these are relations, right? This is like this, you can imagine a string going between my hands here. Like that's a relation. Like the person in this position and the person or people in this position, like they're going to have like very, this is going to be very specific to like this, the string they're holding between them. You're not going to have universal moral principles because our relationships are so unique. Now, that doesn't mean that, every single individual is going to have all these like really unique like moral obligations. Like you could think about connections between entire communities where there's going to be moral obligations born from that. But it's always going to be a matter of looking at like a specific situation, like looking at people in specific positions, how somebody is situated, and this was the this point that Nell Noddings makes about rejecting universalizability on the grounds of rejection of sufficient similarity. What she's saying is there's never enough sufficient similarity for like taking that kind of Kant approach, where no matter what your position is, this is always going to be your moral obligation. Like when it comes to the killer knocking on the door, like we talked about with Kant, everybody would somebody remind me do you remember what Kant said when the killer comes to knock on our door to ask if we know where our neighbor is and we're hiding our neighbor in our basement because they
yes, that you have to tell.
Yeah, that you have to tell them. It doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
Noddings, somebody tell me, based off of all the stuff I've said, what is Noddings going to say about that?
To consider the person that you're hiding. Like I maybe
yeah, that's on the right track. That's on the right track. Who is this? Is this Ray? Ray? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Consider like this is your neighbor, right? So what do you think? Like you have this person who's clearly, like malicious intent knocking on your door, being straight up like, I want to kill your neighbor. Tell me where they are. Who do you think Noddings is going to say you have the strongest obligation to?
The one that's gonna get the harm.
Yeah. And your neighbor, like this person, like you've yeah, you can imagine a situation maybe where, yeah, this is this person that like you've known your whole life and like they've been like always been like so kind to you and like would always like make you special cookies on certain holidays and like you have this like love and affection, like these like feelings of affections too, like somebody maybe like babysat you when you're a little kid. All of those things are like Noddings is going to say, and like people that endorse care ethics in general are going to say like those feelings that you have that like, oh, like this person is like always been so good to me. Like, I feel like I need to do things for them in return. The people that are advocates of care ethics say, listen to those feelings. Those feelings are evidence of just like this basic intrinsic understanding that we have as humans by virtue of the relationships we have with one another. Those feelings are the things that signal to us our moral obligations, our moral values. Like, listen to that. Sort of when people say, like, listen to your intuitions, kind of thinking. It's like, listen to those really strong feelings. Like, that makes you feel gross telling the killer like where this person is. And maybe even if you don't really know that neighbor very well, just like feeling like, ooh, like as another like fellow human being, like there's this person that is just straight up like, I'm gonna kill this person. You might feel some like, like I just want to I want to care for this person. Like, I don't want to be the person that like turns them in. Like, that's wrong. People, like advocates of care ethics are going to say, listen to that feeling. That feeling is evidence of a moral obligation that we have. It's sort of like that tiny voice, that little conscience that some people talk about having in the back of their mind. That is the thing, that voice comes from our relationships and our connections to one another. So, although Notting's approach is a little bit less focused on like the hyper gender stuff, like carving things up, carving up these moral intuitions is like, it's very black or white. Like, we have like these like two sides, like the male and the feminine. Like, although Notting's approach is a lot better than Gilligan's, it's still very much rooted in the idea that there's like these like maternal care relation type things, rooted in these feelings that we have. And from there, like I was saying, born our moral obligations. It's kind of like this like inherent sense that gives us like those feelings of care and that kind of like obligation are the signs, like the little seeds within us that we can like nurture and grow into like strong, good moral principles. Like, but it's still, so this approach is still very much rooted in the idea that there's like this like feminine, motherly kind of like quality to ethics that everybody should be paying attention to. And again, like I mentioned, that we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is a pretty big problem for care ethics in general. So now we're going to turn to a different lens that we can see the ethics of relationship through. It's like we're going to look at the second filter on the ethics of relationship. And this is, what I have described, this is just me, as ethics rooted in community. And there's two main examples that the textbook talked about. There is Quasi Wiridu's ethics, and he talks about he's a Ghanaian philosopher, and he talks about and he's a Khan, and he talks about this Akan maxim concerning our connections to one another, what that means, and the moral implications of that. And then there's also Gregory Kajate, who's Pueblo Indian, and he speaks of that coming from his connection to like Pueblo Indian community. So although neither of these philosophers would describe themselves as like, I do ethics rooted in community, they're starting from their own communities. Like, it's like what they learn from existing within those communities. And we'll see very quickly like how this works, but it's just starting with those communities to derive a richer, fuller, broader sense of our ethical obligation. So yeah, I just want to reiterate, because I am the one that put this term on it. Neither philosopher would describe themselves as people that do ethics necessarily like rooted in community. It's a little bit more specific for each of them. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions right off the bat about sort of this this next lens that we're going to be looking at the ethics of relationship through?
No, I am familiar with the Akan Maxim. I'm from Ghana, and
that is yeah, that's awesome. I'm so glad. I was thinking about asking, because I've had a lot of students from Ghana in the past. I was going to ask, but then I didn't want to put anybody on the spot. Yeah, Victoria, I don't want to put you on the spot and make you do work,
no, I'm okay.
Do you want to talk about like your understanding of
as a Ghanaian or as an African, from my roots, we have a sense of community. So everyone is each other's keeper, so to speak. So growing up, even someone not from my family can scold you. It's like he or she is not my parent, but they feel an obligation to scold you when you're wrong.
Yep.
And there's that saying, this maxim means that we all need each other. We all need help. I think it references the ocean, the PowerPoint, the picture that you brought up earlier. So it's we are all connected some way, somehow. We all need each other.
Yeah. So Wiradoo, and I'm saying that right. Wiradoo.
It's Kwesi Redu.
Kwesi Wiradoo.
Yes.
Oh, it's Kwesi. Okay. I looked it up, but it's
Kwesi Redu.
What was that?
Kwesi Redu.
Redu. Oh, thank you. Redu. Okay. Yeah, I was actually really annoyed that the textbook didn't give a phonetic pronunciation to it, because because I looked online and it was a mix, which unfortunately happens. I feel like
Kwesi is easy. Kwesi.
Yeah, Kwesi. Okay, Kwesi Redu.
Yeah.
So with Kwesi Redu, this is really where we're going to be digging into the significance of those interdependence maps. Like, I think he actually describes like these concentric circles existing within one another as a way to sketch out what Victoria was just describing in terms of, like this very deep connection between individuals and the community and societies that they exist within. Actually, before I go on, Shanili mentioned that. Oh, so Shanili, is your mic working? Did you want to explain this just a little bit more, this connection that you see between this Dominican saying about interdependency and Redu's?
Well, yeah, and actually it's not just a Dominican saying, it's mostly like a Hispanic, like in general saying.
Mm-hmm.
But I can speak to Dominican specifically. What it kind of means is like, today for me, tomorrow for you. It's like, if there's this need that you need met, as in it could be childcare, it could be maybe you're going hungry, or you need some type of aid, intervention, or like a need to be met, and I can meet that need for you or help facilitate it, then, well, I'll do that for you. And, and it also conveys like, hey, a sense of responsibility. Like, I'm here for you, but you're also here for me. Sorry, that's my tablet.
No, I mean, no, that's very appropriate. Appropriate. I feel like that's such a great, like, yeah, it's just being in school and then like having your kid, right? Like, there's so much that, yeah, it's just very relevant to, but, yeah, I think I did want to ask, so Shanelia, do you feel like it's almost like there's something getting lost in translation in like the significance of the interdependency and the obligations that come out of that?
Well, I think it gets lost in translation when we bring it to like our American values, because we're so individualistic here. So it's kind of like like here we're so much like about self-growth and personal gains and like that, but we thrive as a community in the Dominican Republic. Like, we're so much a social unit, and it's like we also like, even over there, like even stranger danger wasn't that much of a thing, because we depend on our neighbors, if that makes sense, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Being the
yeah,
question.
I think this is such a, yeah,
I
okay.
agree.
Okay. Oh, this is so great. Okay. So Victoria, you agree with what Shanelia just said, and you feel like that is this, like, getting lost in translation piece is kind of relevant to the Econ maxim. Is that right?
Oh, no, I was, no, my yes was for the sense of community. It's like, yeah, that wasn't for the sense of community. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I see. Yeah, I think because this is, obviously I am born and raised in the United States. And not only that, but like most of my background's in Western analytic philosophy. I mean, I am obviously familiar with these philosophers, but because I started out from that very individualistic perspective, I mean, even when I was learning about taking like my first ethics class, I was only taught about care ethics, like Redu and Cogite were not mentioned in the class. Like, they just were talking about the care ethics stuff, which in a lot of ways is pretty individualistic. It's like sort of like starting from this point of like like a mother's relationship to their child or whatever, right? Like, there is a lot of individualism there. And I was thinking that perhaps there was some stuff that maybe it was getting a little bit missed, because it's something that is so different. It's like an entirely different starting point in thinking about who, like, we are, where our sense of identity comes from. And for both of these philosophers. And yeah, I mean, I think that something that I'm very familiar with, like, so Jose mentioned this point about like leaving your door open and stuff like this, like this idea of like property and don't talk to me, like, why I came from California. That was where I grew up. And a stranger coming up and just talking to you, they're like, and I grew up in San Francisco. Like, I grew up in a city, and like, that was considered a huge, like, why is this person talking to me? Like, I don't know this. When I came to New York, there was a lot, but there's still definitely that there. But it was much different. Like, there was much more openness to just like engaging with strangers. Like, the example I often go back to, it was one of my first things I really noticed is when there's a mom who's like trying to get the baby carriage down, going into the subway, just random strangers going up and helping. On the West Coast, at least the places where I lived, that sort of behavior, just kind of hopping in like that, was considered kind of weird. Like, people would sooner turn the other way and just pretend that it wasn't happening, because it was like weird to just like approach a stranger, than it would be to help somebody who's clearly in need. Yeah, I know, it really sucks. And so, yeah, it's interesting because I think there's this stereotype about like New Yorkers being so harsh and all this stuff. And I remember moving to the East Coast and being like, oh my gosh, there's so much more, like, people are such kinder, they're faster, they're like, you need to like keep up, but like people are so open and willing to help and like acknowledging when somebody is like struggling, and that seemed like a really, people New York is having coming together in times of need. I think that's like a special quality. And it's that, I think, so that's like a kind of like US version of the contrast of maybe some of the ethics that we're talking about here. And I mean, based off of what I'm seeing in the chat box and just like the couple of comments that have gotten made, I think that there's people in this classroom that understand this ethical approach, specifically like this idea of ethics being rooted in community, far better than I do. But you know, so yeah, anybody who wants to just like jump in, I won't even like require like the raise hand function. Like if I'm talking about explaining this a little bit now, and there's something you want to say, like I defer to the people who actually understand this better than I do in this particular case. So yeah, feel free to hop in as I'm explaining the rest of these two philosophers have done on this particular subject. So like Victoria was talking about, we have before I dig in a little bit more detail, is there anything anybody wanted to add or question or confusion about anything I've talked about so far, just kind of in this general overview of this approach to ethics rooted in community? Okay. All right. So we start with Radu wrote this essay, The Moral Foundations of African Culture. And in it, he talks a lot about this idea of humans needing help. And Victoria elaborated on it a little bit, like, you know, this idea of like reprimanding a kid, even if the kid's not yours, because of this like obligation you feel to like help. And then Shanelia was kind of talking about some similar stuff in helping people and just like how that kind of like works, where you're just like hopping in, helping people out, even if the way that we might see it, or rather like somebody from my perspective might see it, like even if I might call that, you know, somebody you don't know, but in a lot of ways, what counts as like a person you don't know, maybe from like my cultural perspective, that's not what's at play here, right? Like it is people that, you know, just by virtue of these relations that you have with them in community. And it's this idea, this overall philosophical approach to ethics is very much rooted in looking at those interdependence maps that you were drawing. Like I had mentioned kind of just a few minutes ago, when Radu talks about the concentric circles, right? Like that is the interdependence map. And when you focus on that, right? When you look at that, I'm just pulling up the quiz question here, because like I promised, I was like, when people are asking the questions about the quiz, I was like, oh, we'll spell this out in more detail later. So this question, the question number 3 from the quiz, that was like, what does this map, looking at this, what does that indicate about interdependence? I mean, simply put, it indicates the fact that the interdependence exists. It gives us our basic fact, our starting point, fact of our existence, to pull out, and from there, this fact of our existence, our connections to one another. From there, what we can pull out are these, what Radu would describe as prescribed codes of conduct, right? So like Victoria mentioned, you know, when you see a little kid misbehaving, you jump in, you reprimand, you scold, right? And I think that's such a great example because it reflects how the stark contrast to a more individualistic, less interdependence map focused kind of understanding of moral obligations, right? Which is a really complicated way of saying a really complicated way of saying like in the US, oftentimes, somebody tell me what would happen if somebody hopped in or like maybe you've actually seen it, somebody hopping in and like scolding a child that it was like at like a grocery store or like clothing store or something, like some little kid's misbehaving and like the kid doesn't directly know, hasn't met, hops in and goes like, no, you shouldn't be doing that. What would happen if the child's parents saw that? Somebody tell me.
Oh my goodness. All hell,
What'd you say?
all hell will break loose. You dare not scold somebody else's child here.
Yeah.
Just walk away. Walk away.
Yeah, you pretend, because you don't tell somebody what to do with their kid, right? Like this, I think that's something that I hear so often. It's just like this given fact, right? And I think that really shows how far somebody who feels like that's just this obvious truth, right? It shows how far their way of they have not looked at these interdependence maps, perhaps, right? And I mean, you know, to the person's credit who's like, yeah, you just don't tell, you know, like there's ways that maybe we could sort of draw out those kinds of obligations, but at the very least, it shouldn't just be an obvious, it doesn't need to, it is not just an obvious fact of the matter that you shouldn't scold a little kid. Like there are going to be different ways of seeing the world, how we exist in it, and who we are that might produce a different answer to what you should do when you see a small child misbehaving. And that is, thank you again, Victoria. I think that's such a great example where there's just, you know, even you could imagine a situation maybe with like a slightly different set of like values and expectations and relationships and these sorts of things, like needs, like if, you know, for whatever reason, children misbehaving was not any kind of issue, right? There wouldn't be a strong focus on having to attend to something like that. Nonetheless, you could still use the kind of the bare bones of what Radu is talking about here to build a different set of moral obligations, moral values that are born from our relationship. At the end of the day, what matters most are the ways in which these prescribed codes of conduct function in a way to uplift the community, function in a way that provides fundamental help and assistance to one another. And the thinking there, and anybody who wants to elaborate on this for any reason, or Victoria, if like you have like a better understanding of how this works, but this idea that I was talking about in the very beginning, like this, like it's just this fact of the matter that like, you know, like no person is an ocean. It's not just like to try to see yourself in this way, like the single person being an ocean completely out there on your own, no help from anybody. For Radu is going to be akin to just like stepping outside of life itself. Yeah, Victoria, did you want to add to something there?
Yes, I'm just using myself as an example, just to So I am who I am today, not just because of my parents, not just my parents alone. It's my community, the church that I grew up in, my parent, the social, circle, like everyone that a lot of people have imparted my life. So that's how I see this. It's like it's a communal, it's not just my parent, but like everybody has played a part in who I am and the values and the morals that I live by. They stem from all these relationships. That's how I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah, and that is that idea of like who you are being intrinsically tied. That's like, yeah, that's a perfect way to understand or for anybody who's trying to wrap their head around what we're talking about right now, how Victoria just described the way that her identity is inextricably tied up to these circles, these interdependent circles. Like those two things are part and parcel from one another. You can't pull them apart. Just like the connection with others in who you are. Those two things are just like, they're like woven up in one another. They're, yeah, like part and parcel of like the same thing. Yeah, Lisa, this saying like it takes a village is very much rooted in the stuff that we've been talking about here. Actually, I'm going to skip just because of some of the things that Victoria brought up. I'm going to get to Kajate in just a minute. I wanted to also talk about somebody you didn't read. She's a political philosopher. Her name is Vanessa Wills, and she talks a lot about freedom. She's a Marxist philosopher. That's if anybody, we don't have to talk about what that is or anything, but this is like, she talks a lot about like structuring of society and what freedom looks like and economic justice and these sorts of things. And in those kinds of conversations, she said some things that very much echo both what we talked a little bit about with Radu, as well as the stuff that Victoria was just talking about. These quotes are from a podcast that she did with another philosopher named Maisha Cherry. If anybody's interested in the podcast, let me know. I'd be happy to share the link. But she talks about how it's through our interconnection to one another that we have this freedom to really develop ourselves. So like, again, yeah, thinking back to what Victoria was saying about like the relationships that she has, in what Wills is saying is like, in looking at those connections, kind of like, I think some of this might be tied up almost in like that sense of gratefulness that we get in looking at that stuff. We have this freedom to develop ourselves, sort of like this freedom to like know ourselves better. And as a result of that exploration, like developing ourselves, really like coming fully into who you are, right? Like I think that we see there are like a lot of movie plot lines that revolve around, especially like coming of age stuff, like learning to like accept who you are and these sorts of things. Although in movies, like they kind of like gloss over a lot of the important facts associated with that stuff. I think much of the time sort of floating around in the background is this idea that like, like loving and accepting like where you come from, looking at the details involved with, yeah, these like individual or these like different relationships that you have with one another. And it's through that, Wills argues, and I think that this is very much in line with the stuff that Victoria was just talking about, that we develop who we are. It's through those connections that we like kind of flourish. It's not in spite of it, right? Like this is where, Wills is also born and raised in the United States. And like, she talks a lot about different ways to contrast our, at least in the United States and definitely in Western philosophy, this tendency towards like very individualistic thinking. And so what she's commenting on here is like, it's, we don't like, it's not a matter of all these people coming in and trying to change who we are, and we need to just like be free of all of that constraint and just like explode into whoever we want to be. It's because of that stuff coming in, that input, that we develop who we are. It's not in spite of it. It's not, we can't see it as ourselves like, oh, I wish I was in that ocean all on my own. Brady is going to say that that is to just like turn a blind eye to life itself. And Wills is going to say that you're ignoring the stuff that can help you flourish into a better person when you do that. And that's not to say all of our relationships, and we're going to talk about this very shortly when it comes to different challenges for the ethics of relationship. It's not to say all of the relationships we have, every single community expectation, cultural expectation, those sorts of things are things that you're morally obligated to abide by. However, it is to say that in maybe looking at potential conflict, we learn more about ourselves. So a kind of one way to sort of like see this, and this is kind of taps into some of the stuff that I was saying that Ray mentioned in the beginning when he was talking about his quiz answer and being like, oh, well, my whole goal in doing this task is to not talk to anybody, right? And I was saying, well, we're going to get into that a little bit later. So I have this meme here, right? I think like, I don't know, people have probably seen it or seen something like it, right? Where we have like the joke about how like you didn't, it's like the homebody joke kind of thing. And I think something to notice is like that relief for those of you who are homebodies or introverts, which I definitely see myself as an introvert despite like my job that I do, but like for those of us that really like to dig in, stay home, would prefer to do that rather than like go out and like do really like socially engaging things. That like, I just get to like be by myself, or people, those of us who aren't morning people that are like, my like nice morning quiet time. So like those moments of like quiet and separation in a way, like the only reason why we have those moments are because they contrast the other moments where we're connecting. Like, even if you are somebody that gets a little bit drained by big like social engagements and you really regenerate, re-energize by sitting at home, binging Netflix, whatever, that contrast, that dynamic is something that very much builds who you are. And then in just looking at that, like looking at the absence of the immediate interactions with others and the kind of insight that gives us. First of all, it doesn't require that like you hate your friends, right? That you don't want to go out with them. No, you love your friends. Probably feels nice to get invited out at the very least. And also like it gives you like some time to just like enjoy some like really like savor like the time that you have and like dig into whatever your like more regenerating sort of behaviors are. And I think like similarly, and it's in finding those balances for people that are like that people that are like me, where they like regenerate by just staying at home, not having a lot of social contact, finding that balance between, you know, alone time and time with friends, like can be a really important thing. And, you know, sort of like vice versa. If you're somebody who really like your thing that like really energizes you, regenerates you, your way of like, kind of like bouncing back from a long work week is like going out with friends, like doing social sorts of things, you know, having the alone time, like, or rather that contrasting like your alone time and the time where like you're feeling isolated, like it's through that dynamic that you can like kind of like do whatever your self-care thing looks like. And it's about finding that balance too. So in examining these sorts of things, like we are really acknowledging the importance of our interdependence on one another, like the importance of our friendship, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you know, during your regenerative time, like relationship, friendship is going to play a really important role in your ability to do that. And then in looking at that, we can sort of develop and explore who we are. And this really contrasts again the idea that we just because or rather, you know, it contrasts this idea, I think, this very individualistic sort of mindset where, you know, and I think this is something that we, you know, we often see. It's something that was really common when I was growing up, in the way that a lot of, and it's different now, but a lot of Republicans talked about what kind of government they wanted, where it was like, I don't want the government telling me what to do. I want to have my blah, 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 blah. Like, I don't want to, like all this, like, I just want to like go sit in my shed out in the middle of nowhere and like be my like one man ocean. Right. That was a very common mindset of a lot of Republicans, like kind of like in the like President Bush era, like circa 2005, 2000, early 2000s, early aughts ish. And I mean, I think that we see that in various forms now. And it's that kind of like, don't tell me what to do. Like the best, you know, the best version of the world is going to be the version where like everybody can do just about as much as they can possibly, you know, want, no constraints, no worries, no concerns about others. That kind of mindset, that idea that there is freedom there, Wills argues is inherently flawed because of this contrast that I mentioned a second ago. It's that we have, even in the moments of isolation, there's really important ways that our relationships, our connections, our interdependence on one another factors into the good moments that we have, the like nourishing, developing, exploratory moments that we have, even on an individual level. So it's a sort of like halfway point that Wills is making a point that is a sort of halfway between what Radu is talking about and like a more extreme, like individualistic, like we could even still have some of the individualistic ways of thinking that are common in cultures in the United States. And even then, we can still acknowledge the importance of what Radu is talking about. Like, even if we think about ourselves on an individual level as like flourishing, like humans developing, we there's nonetheless this fact of the matter about our independence on one another. And through those relations of interdependence are born important moral obligations to one another. And satisfying those moral obligations does not necessarily come at the cost of compromising freedom. I think a really common thing that I'm familiar with here, again, like in the like cultural setting that I grew up in, is this idea, and there's a lot of different cultures where there's obligations for a certain born, sometimes it's youngest, sometimes it's oldest, sometimes it's daughter, sometimes it's son, their obligation to take in the parents, right? Like, yes or no in the chat box. Is somebody familiar with at least one culture where everybody, yeah, yes or no in the chat box. Is somebody familiar with at least one culture where there's some like set guidelines, set codes of conduct, you might say, for who takes in the parents or parent as they get older? Yeah. Oh, we got a few no's. I know there's definitely more people than this in the class. So everybody in the chat box. If you could just like think, it doesn't have to be like a culture you're deeply familiar with. It could have been something that you saw on TV once. I know that there's more people. Oh, oh yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, there's definitely, you know, like it's like you can imagine it's not a culture you belong to, Kaden. It's just like a culture in general where there's some expectations that like the firstborn daughter has to take in the parents when they're aging. Right. Yeah. So you don't have to keep your parents. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting, I think that the idea of adoption is like, is a very, you know, like what kind of obligations happen there, and the way the certain systems for adoption, like how adoption works in different societies. Here it's something that is you know, like almost entirely determined by the courts, and in a lot of other places it's determined by like closest relative, or sometimes even just like members of a community, like somebody who was like a neighbor or lived in the town where a child was born. That is like the and in certain cases it's like written into the laws that that's how the adoption is going to work. In any case, yeah, we see like these different codes of conduct surrounding like, yeah, obligations to care for parents, and in those kinds of those kinds of settings starkly contrasts something that I am very familiar with here, where people will say, like people that I think like, especially I've seen this more so in like white people, but like this, like, oh my God, like and it's not only white people, but I think maybe just because those are like conversations that I've been in with where this has come up more, just like this, like I would never, like, oh my gosh, having to like, oh, my mother-in-law, like, oh, everybody hates their mother-in-law, like that kind of thinking, that kind of approach, like again is a very stark contrast to one that sees a lot of importance in focusing on our interdependence on one another. So the next person that we're going to talk about who sees ethics through this lens is Gregory Cogite. Like I said, he's a Pueblo Indian and a philosopher, and he talks a lot about how, and this is also in lines with what Wills discusses, the significance of freedom in being yourself, requiring that we, like Radu was talking about, acknowledge this identity rooted in community. And it's through that recognition, and I think that this is something that's that I like, if we could take just like a quote, that like a quote block text of like what Victoria was talking about when she was like speaking about like these different relations that she had, and sort of like in building like her identity. If that is that kind of quote, that kind of somebody saying that, having that view, somebody like Cogite is going to argue that it is through our ability to recognize and look at that we are able to really fully, completely express our lives and who we are. So we can see, you know, although they are on two almost totally opposite ends of the sphere geographically, Radu and Kajite, like speaking to how this ability to really fully understand your identity necessarily requires seeing your relations with others, as like the core fundamental, in looking at those relations and then seeing that as like this, this core to sort of the ethical principles, the moral values that we derive. And what Kajite adds to this is what Wills was talking about, where we have, in looking at those things, like sort of like in this whole project, in looking at how we're going to ground our moral principles, we become free. That kind of freedom to express oneself that, say, like people talk about so much in the United States, right? First Amendment rights, free speech stuff. He's saying that even more fundamental to that familiar idea is this right to be yourself. And the only way that you can be yourself is by recognizing your relations, like how your identity is born from the communities that you exist within. So it's interesting because we were talking about how the ethics, if you remember, the ethics of persons is connected to certain rights that the Constitution in the United States talks about, right? Like we remember, like, it's like, yeah, you need to have like freedom to some extent in order to, be positioned to like be happy or pursue happiness. And like, yeah, you're like be equal, like all of these kinds of rights that are like talked about in the Constitution. And we're saying how like the ethics of persons really supports that stuff. Here is another interesting way to get at a very different sense of the word freedom, but one that nonetheless is advocating for people to be free. And instead of thinking about it in this way of like being free from people telling me that I can't do stuff, Kajite is talking about when we look at our relations, who we are by virtue of our relations to others in community, that gives us the ability to be free in terms of really fully knowing ourselves, understanding ourselves, not experiencing some kind of like pressure to like be something that goes against who we are. And really importantly, it gives us the ability to like recognize the kinds of obligations that we have to one another. So to kind of sum up the way that these two different lenses work, both Radu and Kajite, or all three philosophers, Radu, Kajite, and Wills to some extent, say that this fact about us, this fact about our, this interdependence that we have on one another, from there are born our moral principles. They all agree on that. Radu focuses on helping one another, the kinds of obligations, like that's like the primary focus, at least in the essay that was discussed in the chapter, this essay, The Moral Foundations of African Culture, talks about how that gives rise to certain codes of conduct. And Kajite, although he definitely agrees with that, talks a lot about how that when we are thinking about that interconnectedness, that core of our sort of like our ethical theory web, what we find is we're entitled to a certain kind of freedom for like self-exploration and development. So they both, I mean, they both agree, but it's like they both pull out different sort of implications from seeing things, seeing the ethics of relationship through this lens of ethics rooted in community. That's sort of to sum it up. So does anybody have any questions about that so far? Great. Okay, so we're just going to move through these challenges pretty quickly because I think that we've brought up most of them. So the first challenge that I'm going to talk about is this one that I mentioned in the very beginning about like essentializing and just kind of like, I think the main problem with that, and this is really only for there's very little essentializing, at least in terms of gender, that happens within that lens of seeing ethics rooted in community. So within care ethics specifically, you don't want to hinge a theory on something that people can disagree with. So like if somebody doesn't like agree with the way that you're carving up these like essential features between men and women, then they're not going to listen to the rest of your theory. So it makes for a pretty problematic argument. You kind of don't want to like open yourself up to unnecessary problems. And then additionally, beyond that, there are some really serious issues with how they're essentializing with women, sort of like operating as all women, right? All women, or this inherent feminine thing being like the caretaker. And I think that we should see why that's deeply a problem because of a lot of what Radu talks about. Right? Because this helping thing is not something, it's something inherent to, gives a very full, rich, strong explanation as to why that's something rooted in community. It's not something that is inherently feminine. So that's like, and then additionally on top of that, like there's a lot of gendered stuff around like, you know, the kinds of things that women are expected to do. Textbook talks about this a little bit. Like it really plays into the ways in which different women are oppressed. Like we don't really want to support that sort of thing. So it's a kind of problematic place to start. Despite that, though, we can still see that there is some value to what's being thought about there. Like it is kind of refreshing to hear about an ethical theory that goes like, hey, you know, that little voice in the back of your head that's like, ooh, that's really gross to tell this murderer that you're hiding your neighbor in your basement. Like it's saying like, no, that's important. Listen to that voice. Like we like that. Another way to sort of explain how that voice works and the moral principles or ethical codes of conduct that fall out of that is by saying, rooted in community. There's like relations that we have, and it's really important to respect those relations. Now, an immediate problem comes up with that though, because as I'm sure every single person here could find some example for me, or yeah, as I am, or I don't know, I didn't phrase that correctly, but, you know, talking about codes of conduct, relations, expectations born from our interdependence on one another. And in particular, the different sort of cultural norms and expectations surrounding what the right thing to do is. I would imagine anybody here could find me an example where there are certain cultural norms or expectations like that are deeply problematic. You know, the way that various like religions, governments, and or cultures treat gay people, right? Or women or trans people. And when we see these dehumanizing, sometimes like oftentimes life-threatening and violent kind of cultural norms and expectations that are technically born from relations between members of a community, the ethics of relationship doesn't give us a very good, clear method for addressing that stuff. Like we almost, not entirely, by any means, not entirely, but we run into a kind of parallel problem that we saw with cultural relativism, where it's like, oh, well, you know, like to each their own, like you can't judge, blah, 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 blah. Now, there are different ways to bypass that. Like I've talked about pretty much with, you know, any really big issue for any of the theories that we've talked about, I've always like mentioned at the end when I get to these slides, I'm like, oh, you know, there's like certain ways that we could get out of this. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to dig into like all of these different ways to like address this issue that pops up for the ethics of relationship. The main thing to keep in mind, though, we don't need to get into that, to just understand, like, when we feel compelled to apply this particular ethical theory, we really want to look at like, okay, is there going to be, there's this issue related to being able to criticize, like this kind of cultural relativism type issue associated with applying this theory. Let me just think about whether that might be relevant here, right? And it's a good thing to bear in mind. So it's like not a knockdown, like we need to throw out this theory. We haven't run across really any issue with any of the theories we've talked about where there's like a knockdown, throw it out level issue. But it is a shortcoming, and it's something that we do really want to bear in mind when we're thinking about appealing to the ethics of relationship in order to give some kind of moral argument. Also, kind of related to this, this issue of being able to criticize problems, you know, serious ethical concerns that arise within community, like some kind of like norms, expectations, ways certain groups are treated, that problem is one that it results from all of this variation, right? Like depending on different circumstances, you know, the kinds of obligations, codes of conduct, these sorts of things that arise from our relations with one another, it's going to vary. You know, there might not be as much obligation surrounding helping to like being a member of the village that raises the child if there aren't a lot of children in a particular community, right? So as a result of that general, these kinds of, you know, like how unique all of these different kinds of relations are, even when it's on a broader scale, like the position that we're in, remember, like I was saying, like how people or communities are situated, like the string that they're, you know, if you imagine like got two, this is a relation between two communities and I have a string going here connecting my hands, like this particular circumstances are going to dictate the kinds of like relevant moral values and these sorts of things at play. And because it's so particular, it's so focused on like these individual kinds of relationships, it makes it really hard to generalize certain things that we might want to generalize, like it doesn't matter where you are, what kind of culture you come from, like it's not okay to like be racist, right? Especially because, I mean, you could look at pretty much any country, any culture, and with very few exceptions, you're going to find some racial differences within those cultures. And inevitably, you will always find different treatment based on oftentimes not necessarily even different race, but just even like very like skin tone, right? Like I think that probably a lot of people here are familiar with issues surrounding colorism, like how dark your skin is in a certain place, and that can, and those kinds of differences, these like just these technically superficial differences give rise to practices, norms, expectations, sometimes codes of conduct that result in somebody being treated poorly because they have because of the color of their skin. And if we want to say that that's wrong in general, one sort of downside to the ethics of relationship is that it's hard to make those kinds of generalizations. Now, like I mentioned a long time ago, maybe we want to say something just about our basic human relation to one another, but that would need some spelling out. Okay. And finally, this is something that the textbook mentioned. I think that it's actually not that big of a problem, but you know, the further out our circles go, the harder it is sometimes to really like find like things, obligations, moral principles that that derive from people that we're very, very disconnected from. But there's a number of reasons I think that we don't need to worry too much about that particular issue. There's different ways that we can sort of like think about ourselves in terms of, you know, really like the downstream effects of like consequences of our actions, and like how ultimately we can end up drawing certain interdependence maps that like hopefully give us enough to sort of figure out why, you know, it's say like not okay to do something that's going to have a negative effect on somebody who exists, who lives far away from you, like on the other side of the world. Yeah, because I'm just gonna, so I'm gonna breeze past that. If that is an issue that anybody read about in the chapter and like you're feeling like, oh, I'm not going to ask about this on the midterm, the strangers issue in particular, and I'm not going to ask about it on the module worksheet. So if it's something that's nagging at you and you're feeling really curious about, you're welcome to email me about it, but I'm going to cut us off here because what I would like to do is for everybody to take, actually, okay, so first, that's going to conclude the lecture for today. I'm going to pull everyone about something in just a moment. But did anybody have any questions that didn't get answered about some of the stuff we were talking about just now? We're good? Okay. And then second, I'm going to give everybody an option. So we end class at 11:40. So about 25 minutes. Would you can say, actually, let's see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have us take a 5-minute break. And if you are feeling worried about the Module 3 worksheet, go to Blackboard, take a look at it. You can spend break time reading through the worksheet, coming up with any questions that you might want to ask. Or if you need the 5-minute break right now, because we went through a lot, just take the 5-minute break, come back, and then after our break, I'm gonna be here to sit and answer questions for the last 20 minutes of class, just so everybody feels like they have what they need, or at least they figure out where they need to go in order to do well on the module worksheet. Okay, is there any questions about that? Okay, all right, so let's bring it back in 5 minutes. So at 11:20. People are ready to ask some questions about the Module 3 worksheet. And if you want to use the chat box, that's okay, but I would prefer that you ask your question through the mic. So first of all, does anybody have an issue not being able to look at the worksheet? Like everybody can find it on Blackboard and all that good stuff.
Your modules keep getting longer and longer.
Yeah, because I put stuff in it as we do stuff, right? Like the PowerPoints and the assignments, right? That makes sense, right, Kaden? Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Professor. Yes,
Yeah,
it makes
yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, you can also look at it like, especially when you see like all the PowerPoints and all the lectures, like we're doing a lot in this class too. So you can like see it as like, I sat through that and I did that quiz. And even if you didn't do all of it, like it's still like that's, being there for some of it. Like those are all marks of achievement, right? Okay, so let's see, is anybody? Yep. Oh, you're loves my PowerPoint. I work really hard on those PowerPoints because
Yeah, he loves them.
very much a visual learner. And so when I have like a picture to latch onto, versus the like massive blocks of text on a PowerPoint, I'm just like, my eyes glaze over. You might as well not have the PowerPoint. Which is most philosophy talks, unfortunately. People don't take my approach. I have to sit through many talks where there's a lot of texty PowerPoints. Okay. So all right. This is really like, this is everyone's opportunity to ask some questions. Maybe while some people are thinking about questions, I can talk a little bit about just some things related to really utilizing that WhatsApp group that you all have going. That again, it sounds like, I don't know if there's like a couple of really helpful people in the chat or if everybody is just like really doing a nice job, like supporting one another. But I've never had so few questions coming from students before. And I was actually a little worried about it, but then everybody seemed to know things like due dates and stuff like this. No questions in the Q&A on the Q&A forum on Blackboard. And I'm guessing that it's because, you have this like really great this great chat going on. So I love that. And I'm really glad that you all can do that. And Shanili, this thing that you're talking about using the textbooks index, as someone who has, I think I have it somewhere. Where is it? I personally did the index for this book here as somebody who has done an index. It wasn't until I actually had to like do an index for a published that like I understood how valuable that that particular feature is, because it doesn't just doing a word search, like if you have a digital copy of a book, the index is specifically curated to draw your attention to the places where you're really getting at the meat of certain ideas. For example, if you're feeling confused about utilitarianism, or say Bentham in particular, or Mill, you can go to the index and you can look, and there might be if you just did like a control F, like look where Mills or Bentham was like talked about in the textbook, you're probably going to get a lot more results. The index is going to show you the key places to look for where those people are discussed. So that's a really great resource to use when you're feeling confused about a particular question. The book is a book. So I do like philosophy of language and like social epistemology stuff. A lot of things related to like philosophy of race and oppression and stuff like this. This book is just about, I lost the cover of it. It's about speech acts. It's about philosophy. It's about philosophy thing and philosophy of language. It's sort of like how to understand the meaning of language by virtue of thinking about it in terms of action. Anyway, so the point I wanted to make about utilizing this group thing is if you're I'm more than as long as you are writing things in your own words, right? Like I can't, if I get 5 people that give me, you know, like identically worded answers to several questions, that's going to be an issue. So as long as you're using your own words, like, yes, utilize the heck out of your WhatsApp group chat. However, something that has happened in the past, because this it sounds like maybe the most successful WhatsApp group chat I've ever had a class participate in, but something that has happened in the past with other ones is that there are sometimes people that feel really confident in understanding something, and it turns out that they've misunderstood it, and it has this trickle down effect of people where yeah, so whatever, I don't like yeah, anybody who hasn't, if you wanted to like share it in the chat, and I understand if you want to like keep that as a place, great. Yeah, so Tianika mentioned like you don't share answers, you help each other understand. Beautiful, wonderful, great. That's what I figured, because you've done a lot of work at this point and I haven't seen matching answers. I think I love that you're having conversations in this place, especially I think sometimes without the professor overseeing it. But yeah, if you want to send some direct messages, like I get the kind of like the value of privacy in that way from me. So yeah, if you want to share, anybody who doesn't, great. So yeah, so the one thing that I want to warn against though is like if you are feeling really confused, so you go into the group chat and it's like somebody and somebody is giving an answer that feels totally alien to the little bit that you've understood, don't just assume that the confident sounding person, or maybe the person even that everybody's agreeing with, is right. Like if you feel tension in your understanding, like you are more than welcome to email me. You can even say, you don't have to name names. You can be like, the WhatsApp is saying like, this is the thing, but I didn't think that that's why the ethics of persons was intrinsically valuable. That didn't make sense to me. You can email me to resolve those kinds of disputes. Just please do not automatically assume that the confident answer, or the answer that everybody seems to be nodding their head at, is necessarily the right answer. Yeah. So, and be sure to utilize that index. You could use the index to help guide your attention to the relevant bits for any one of these questions here, like Kant. You could look at the index. You could look at the index for categorical imperative. And if you don't see anything under C for categorical imperative, you can go to Kant and look for it there. And if you have a digital copy, you can use the Control F function. Sometimes that might help too. Everybody has read these questions, and you feel like nobody has any, where am I supposed to? Thank you, Tianika, for doing that. That's really wonderful. I'm a big fan of sharing epistemic resources, which is a fancy way of saying like, I love people who create knowledge communities. Like, I think those are really great and wonderful. And I really like it when students do it. Right. So for the people that just got the chapters of the textbook, you will need to, and for the most part, like I think in almost all of the questions I identified like which chapter it's going to be in. So like you have, the chapter 5, for instance, is like the ethics of persons. So what you can just do is go into that document, and unfortunately you'll just have to rely on the Control F function. However, if you are in the WhatsApp group, something else that you could consider doing is being like, hey, I just have the chapters, like where did the index, you could ask a classmate, because I know there's people that have the textbook in the WhatsApp group. You could ask like, say like, which pages for this, that sort of thing. So yeah, so hopefully that'll help you out. And then worst case scenario, if you're feeling really lost, you can email me. Even if it is the night before it is due, I think shame is oftentimes the worst enemy of students, where there's like shame, like I didn't do this, I'm behind on this, I should have, she's going to get mad, I'm not going to. If I don't email you back, you can leave the question blank and then, or just write like, I emailed you, I was confused about this question. And like, an email to me about it essentially gives you a little placeholder where you can try to answer that question after I've answered your question about it. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes, it sounds good. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful. So these questions, I guess I'm glad that people feel that people don't have any questions coming up right off the bat with stuff.
It's not that we don't have questions. It's like you kind of have you see, you look at it and like, okay, I can do this. And yet when you start, then you're like, okay, then you
Right.
have to go back to the book and make some references. So
No, I meant just the first. I'm happy. I'm very, very happy because I try to word things in a way. I think, yeah. It's one thing to feel like you understand something, but to phrase a question about it to a group of people is always another. So if people are generally like reading it and being like, okay, I can do this. That's the part where I'm like, wow, okay, like that's amazing. That makes me very, 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 very happy. Yeah, like for example, question number 5, I worded it in another way in case the first way I said it didn't actually make sense to people. In part because I do philosophy of language stuff and I think a lot about communication and that being an important thing. So like, that's a big part of, that's a philosophically and ethically a very important thing to me. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, Kaden. That's wonderful. Okay, well, and yeah, feel free to like raise your hand if you're going through this and you have a question pop up. The 2 other things that I wanted to note is, first of all, I extended the deadline for the module 3 worksheet. Although I had this, I should have put this up 2 days prior to when I did. I should have put it up at the beginning of last week, and I forgot because I'm human. But because of that, it's only fair for me to extend the deadline because it was my error, obviously. So I extended the deadline to March 28th. So on your syllabus, and I'll put an updated version of the syllabus. But currently, right now, the syllabus says it's due on the 26th. It's actually due on the 28th. And it is crucial, though, that everybody gets these into me, because somebody tell me, why are my comments on these worksheets important? I know there's somebody here that knows the answer to this. Why are my comments on this? Tinika, yeah.
I don't know if I'm right, but let me try. Is it because you want us to improve? So maybe if we get our midterm or final, we can do it the way you want it to.
Because these questions might be on the midterm or final. Yeah.
Right.
So this is like the way that this works is like, yeah, I am asking you some tough questions here. Like, this is not easy. This is not easy work, but this is like your chance to like do the first draft. And then the midterm is all about like getting that polished answer, getting that polished answer. Yes. So Jocelyn said, so you can revise them. Shanili said, so you can get my feedback. Yes. Because those things are really important for, like Tianika was saying, the midterm. Okay. So that's kind of the first thing that I wanted to mention. The last thing is, because we covered so much in this module period, like essentially there's so many short answer questions to do, I've made the long answer question extra credit. And essentially what I decided between doing was either having an extra credit question that really digs in. It's pretty like a rigorous, like you have to do a lot of philosophical, semi-heavy lifting to kind of get through what I'm talking about here. And I chose between doing a question like that and doing one where you just had to like write a lot and reflect a lot and requiring it. And I wanted to go the route of offering extra credit to really dig into the things that Ta-Nehisi Coates was talking about and how those issues, specifically anti-Black racism in the United States, connects up with some of the stuff we were talking about in relation to the ethics of persons, supporting this idea of equality and certain like basic human rights. So yeah, if you have read the essay, either like in this class, I would think maybe some people might have read it in another class or just come across it somewhere else. Yeah, you'll need to, and I actually give you the page numbers to look at specifically for this one. So like, in particular, when we were talking about the ethics of persons and I was discussing some of the issues with that particular ethical theory, if that was something that was resonating with you a lot, I really encourage you to, take a stab at doing this extra credit question. And then, but just bear in mind, like you want to focus first on getting through the short answer questions. So does anybody have any people generally understand what I'm asking, like in the long answer question as well? Or if going through the other short answer questions, have any questions come up? Okay. Wonderful. So like I said, I'm available for you to email me if you have any questions that come up. So before we take off though, the last thing I wanted to remind everyone is that we are not meeting this coming Saturday. Does anyone know why? Next
Is it spring break?
It's not spring break.
Midterm?
It's the midterm. Yeah, you'll be working on your midterms, which, if like you set aside this time to do the class, like this is a great block of time to set aside to do the midterm. It's also I am going to be I have email notifications on my phone. And I'm going to be closely watching all of that next Saturday in case people are emailing me with those questions. So you're really like, the only time I will not answer a question about the midterm is when I get an email that says, I don't understand question 11. Like you need to try to explain what you don't understand, right? Really like this was the opportunity I was giving to people to like, if like they saw something right away, they're like, that doesn't make sense. You're like, for example, in 11 here, like according to the ethics of relationship, why is it intrinsically valuable? Like you can say like, I don't understand what you mean by intrinsically valuable here. Are you talking about moral values? Like if you phrase a question like that, I'm happy to answer that. But just emailing me saying, I don't get question 11, I will respond. I need you to be more specific. What don't you understand about the question? Or why don't you show me what your current answer is and I'll let you know if there's any problem. Yeah, Tianika.
Professor, so I'm guessing for the midterm, we won't have, how do you call it? We won't have multiple choice, it'll just be writing, correct?
It will, no, there's, yeah, I explained it on the syllabus, but that was a long time ago. I don't expect you to remember. So it's going to be a selection of questions that are either identical or very similar to questions that you had on the worksheets we've done so far. And then
Mhm.
there will be some multiple choice, true or false.
Okay.
Do not play the gotcha, tricked you. I'm gonna put thing here. Like
Mhm.
I really it's like oftentimes it's stuff that is following directly from like a PowerPoint slide or something like this. Like I don't try to be sneaky. So those are pretty straightforward.
Okay, and are we gonna do it on a Google form and have time to like submit it? Because like a majority of exams are usually timed, or is it gonna be a doc?
It's just going to be a doc. It's going to be like this, and you're going to have 48 hours to complete it. So I'm going to put it up
Okay.
on Thursday night,
Okay.
and it'll be due. Oftentimes I put it up a little bit earlier. But yeah, I'm going to put it
Oh,
up.
so then we could always go back to it.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, or
Okay.
I'm going to put it up Thursday night, or what is it, Friday night, and then it's due Sunday. I say it on I can't remember.
Yeah, you said you're gonna put it, I think, the 31st, and then one of those.
Okay, yeah. So I put it up on the 31st, and then and then oftentimes I'll put it up a little bit earlier. Just
Okay, and is it also gonna be a lot of questions?
I
midterm?
give I give the number on. I thought I gave the number on the yeah. It's
I think it's 50.
What
50,
is it?
right?
Yeah, 50, composed of like true and false.
Is it? Yeah, is that what
Long-
Ray's
long
taken classes
answer.
with me in the past? I use this.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
it's the
Yes,
same
it ends up
format
being
that
about,
she
like-
used in her module, guys. Don't think there's anything new. It follows kind of like the same format.
Yeah, it ends up being.
Oh, okay.
It ends up. Yeah, it ends up. It'll be. Yeah, I don't remember the numbers right off the top of my head. I'm so
Oh,
sorry.
okay. As long as I know like the range, I will go back to syllabus and start studying the worksheets. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Ray, you had a question.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say to talk to you after.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, speaking of, we're 5 minutes over now. So, yeah, let's see. Daniel asked, the modules and the PowerPoints are study guides. Yes. And the lecture videos are also most definitely, definitely study guides. Really, like I pull a lot from the PowerPoints with these questions. Oftentimes, if like you can kind of practice doing this here with all of that pile of info that Caden was like kind of like talking about just like a couple of minutes ago. Like go to the module 3 worksheet or module 3 tab when you're working on this worksheet. Go look at the PowerPoints. A lot of the information is there. It'll help you put the pieces together. And then so the PowerPoints and the module 3 worksheets work as great study guides for the midterm. Okay, so yeah, anybody who has no more questions for me, feeling good to go, obviously email me if anything comes up during the week. Yeah, you're welcome to take off. And yeah, I will not see you next week. I'll be sending out the midterm, but again, yeah, email me if you have any questions. And thanks everybody for a great lecture today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you. Have a
Bye,
good
everyone.
one.
Professor,
Yeah,
I just have
you
to
too.
ask you something in private, not with the material.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just one